In recent years, scientists have been baffled by the so-called double slit experiment, which shows that particles of matter, that's the same stuff that everyone and everything is made from, behave differently depending on whether or not someone is observing them. The idea of the experiment is to first place a sheet of metal parallel to a wall. The sheet of metal has one slit of rectangular shape cut out from within it. Then, using a marble firing gun, marbles are fired at the sheet of metal. Some marbles go naturally through the slit in the sheet and hit the back wall. On the back wall is produced a pattern of the slit where the marbles pass through and hit the back wall. Then a second parallel slit, exactly the same as the first one, is added to the sheet of metal. And again, marbles are fired through both slits. And as a result, as more and more marbles are fired through the two slits, you see a second band of pattern produced on the back wall. All is as it should be so far. Now, the same experiment is reproduced, first using one slit, then two slits. But instead of marbles, a water wave is allowed to pass through the slits. So in this case, the sheet of metal is placed vertically in a bath of water and waves were created. In this case of the metal sheet that had one slit cut within, the wave hits the middle of the back wall and with most intensity, directly in line with the slit. This occurs naturally as water flows through the slit is spread on the other side, with the most water hitting the center of the back wall. This is similar to the line pattern that the marble test created in the first scenario. When the second slit is added to the sheet of metal, something slightly different happens. If the top of one wave hits the bottom of another wave, then they cancel each other out. This creates an interference pattern on the back wall. Basically, the wave hits the back of the wall in many places. Now, when marbles are fired through the two slits, we see two bands on the back wall, and when waves are passed through the two slits, we get an interference pattern of many bands on the back wall. So far, this is normal and well understood science. However, now we go quantum, to the world of the atom, which is, the atom is so small that it's not visible to the naked eye. So the experiment in this scenario is run again, but this time using an electron. An electron is a tiny bit of matter or stuff from which things are made, like marbles. In other words, it's a very small portion of the marble which one could not see with the naked eye. When the electron is fired through one slit, it produces a single band on the back wall, just like it did in the case of firing a marble. However, when the electron is fired through two slits, it produces many bands, like it did for the case where the water went through the two slits. So in other words, it produces a wave on the back wall. The expectation was, of course, that two bands on the back wall should have been produced and not a wave, as only one electron was fired through at a time. Unlike the water, there was no way an interference could occur, as only one electron was fired at a time. The water created an interference pattern because it was waves that passed through the two slits, and they collided together and created an interference pattern. This implies that the electron leaves the gun as a single particle and on its travel becomes a wave, similar to splitting it in two, then goes through both slits, interfering with itself and producing many bands on the back wall, like the water. Now this baffled scientists, so they decided to cheat and take a look using a measuring device to see what the electrons were actually doing. So they checked to see if the electron goes through and hits and where in the travel of the electron does the electron become a wave. But then the most bizarre thing happened. As when the scientists observed the electron, it did not change to a wave but remained as a particle. The electron went through one slit or the other to produce only two bands on the back wall and not a wave pattern. The electron decided to act differently depending on whether or not it was being watched, as though it was aware that it was being watched. The observer collapsed the wave function simply by the act of observing. What does this actually mean? Everything around us is simply waves, like the electron traveling through the two slits. Waves are everywhere and fill up most of the space around us. These waves continually remain this way until we decide to observe them. When we observe the waves, they turn into matter, similar to the waves which turn into an electron, only when observed. Until we observe reality as we know it, it does not actually exist in any particular form. The act of observing causes the object to come into existence, otherwise they do not exist relative to the observer. The thing to note here is that ultimately the object does not exist in a sort of superficial way, similar to the electron, which does not exist, but it is in a different form. It's in a waveform. Depending on what instrument we use to observe, whether it is an eye, an ear, or a nose, or some other electronic piece of equipment, these waves change into matter, such as houses, cars, music, etc. This is the most important point, so I will repeat it. Everything around us exists in the form of waves. Only when we, the observer, using our senses, whether it's our eyes or ears or nose, only then matter or objects, that things around us, come into existence. The act of observing creates the world around us and is created relative to our observation. Just as in science there is nothing to believe, but all ideas can be reproduced by experiment and the results observed by the experimenter, you should experiment and see these ideas for yourself, and do not believe anything until you have seen it for yourself. Although performing the double slit experiment at home will be very difficult and expensive, you could research and see the results by various scientists who have published their results from the experiment. And this can be easily looked up on the internet. This implies that matter does not actually exist as we know it unless or until it is validated or agreed by an observer, that is you. This, as I am sure you will agree, is a mysterious concept and one more aligned with the religious philosophical aspect of consciousness as described earlier, rather than the concrete origins of scientific aspect of consciousness. In order to be notified of my next video, please remember to hit the subscribe button and also remember to turn on notifications.